But without a man to hold on to, how would you stay on the horse? The answer came easily. The same way as you do with my thighs. Everyone imagines medieval women as obedient housewives, but here is the shocking truth. They often had more financial freedom than many women have today. They controlled money, managed property, and made business choices that their husbands had no legal right to overrule. So what medieval laws gave wives this kind of authority that somehow vanished later? When most people picture women in the Middle Ages, they think of quiet figures baking bread while their husbands work the fields. It sounds like the perfect old-fashioned domestic dream, right? But that idea is about as realistic as believing knights spent their days rescuing princesses. The whole traditional wife concept that floats around today did not come from medieval Europe at all. It came straight from the 1950s, when one income could support a family. Medieval families did not have that luxury. Every person, no matter their gender, had to work to survive. Real women in medieval times were anything but passive. During harvest season, they worked right beside men, cutting grain, hauling bundles, and threshing crops. They managed money, ran inns and workshops, and oversaw estates while their husbands were away. The romantic idea that they were sheltered from the harshness of medieval life is a complete myth. Life in that era revolved around survival, and survival did not care about gender roles. Most families lived from season to season, relying on every able hand to keep food on the table. Even among the upper classes, women carried heavy responsibilities. Noble ladies managed vast estates, organized trade deals, and supervised hundreds of workers. These women were not idle decorators of great halls. They were leaders, administrators, and sometimes even warriors in their own right. Medieval society may have been patriarchal, but it still allowed women far more influence than modern stereotypes admit. Records from the period reveal women signing contracts, purchasing property, managing shops, and appearing in court as business owners or creditors. Yet somehow, history books and modern culture turned them into background characters in their own stories. The truth is much richer and far more complicated. Medieval women fought for their interests, negotiated marriages as strategic partnerships, and carved out spaces of power wherever possible. They were not helpless victims of their time any more than people today are bound by theirs. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh for everyone. Disease, war, and famine constantly reshaped society, and those realities often erased traditional expectations overnight. When a husband died in battle or fell to plague, the widow had to take charge. There was no choice but to adapt. In a world where survival came first, women stepped into every role imaginable to keep families and communities alive. Their work was as gritty and exhausting as any man's. So what did this work actually look like? Forget the peaceful image of a woman quietly sewing by the fire. The real medieval woman worked from dawn until nightfall. During harvests, she swung a sickle, carried sheaves of wheat, and sorted grain. Families who failed to gather every ear of grain together risked starving during winter. Women also performed gleaning, combing through fields after harvest to collect any leftover kernels. Nothing went to waste because waste could mean death. In towns, women formed the backbone of local economies. Brewsters, also called alewives, made and sold beer since water was often unsafe to drink. Bakers' wives frequently ran their shops while their husbands worked elsewhere. Some women owned entire businesses, selling candles, wool, pottery, or prepared food. These were not hobbies, but vital sources of income that sustained entire households. The textile industry especially belonged to women. Spinning and weaving were major trades that required immense skill. A good spinner could produce fine thread while walking or watching children, and professional spinsters, originally meaning women who spun for a living, could earn their independence through their craft. Weaving demanded even more expertise, and skilled female weavers often made respectable profits. Upper-class women carried a different, but equally demanding burden. Noble ladies supervised vast estates, ensuring that farming, brewing, livestock, and trade all ran smoothly while their husbands were away. They were essentially CEOs of medieval enterprises. What is fascinating is how normal all this seemed. Medieval society did not divide work into neat categories of men's and women's jobs. The rule was simple. If something needed doing and you could do it, you did it. Survival always came before gender ideology. The medieval woman was no delicate ornament waiting to be saved. She was a worker, manager, trader, and survivor. Far from being powerless, she helped shape the very economy that kept her world alive. A blacksmith's wife might work beside her husband at the forge. A merchant's daughter could travel to markets, barter with traders, and strike her own deals. A farmer's widow might take charge of the entire farm and make it even more successful than her late husband ever did. The belief that medieval women simply stayed home and obeyed their husbands collapses the moment you look at what they actually did each day. These women ground grain, managed finances, supervised workers, and made choices that influenced entire neighborhoods. What is even more fascinating is how much legal authority some of these women actually possessed. The laws about property ownership reveal an even stranger truth. Most people assume medieval women had no rights at all. The usual story says that married women became invisible under the law. That is only partly true. Property laws in the Middle Ages were much more complicated than that. Unmarried women could absolutely own property. They could buy it, sell it, and inherit it just like men. Widows often fared even better. Many areas gave widows automatic rights to 1/3 of their husband's estate, often called dower rights. That was not a symbolic gesture. It included land, homes, livestock, and even cash that legally became the widow's to manage. But here is the part that really changes everything. In some regions, women received half of their husband's wealth the instant they married. Not after he died, but immediately. The wife could control that portion, invest it, and use its profits as she pleased. That makes sense once you realize that marriage was viewed as a financial partnership between two families. There were also plenty of legal workarounds. Medieval people loved creating exceptions, and clever women used them to protect their assets, even after marriage. Some families set up special agreements before the wedding to guarantee a woman's control over certain lands or money. Others used family connections or sympathetic church officials to get favorable interpretations of the rules. Everything depended on location. What was allowed in one county could be outlawed in another. English common law said one thing, while local customs often said something completely different. Towns and cities tended to give women more legal space than small villages did. Merchant families operated by their own standards, while farmers followed older traditions. Widows, in particular, enjoyed a remarkable amount of independence. They could choose to remarry or remain single. They could run their businesses, sign contracts, and appear before judges without anyone's permission. Some became very wealthy. Others used their freedom to travel, invest in new ventures, or donate to causes they cared about. Of course, class mattered too. A noblewoman's daughter could hire lawyers, call in powerful relatives, and rely on social networks that poorer women lacked. Still, even women from modest backgrounds managed to gather small bits of property, run market stalls, or save enough to become financially secure. The strangest twist is that being married sometimes weakened a woman's legal position more than being single or widowed. Marriage often meant her husband made most of the decisions. Once he died or the marriage ended, her independence returned completely. Many widows chose never to remarry for that very reason. Family planning also influenced property rights. Parents often negotiated detailed contracts to make sure their daughters kept control over certain possessions after marriage. Brothers promised to step in if their sisters were mistreated. Entire families worked together to provide a safety net that official laws did not always guarantee. Looking at these property systems shows just how much power medieval women could really hold. Yet ownership was only part of the story. What did they do when legal disputes erupted? You might think medieval women never set foot in a courtroom, but the records say otherwise. They appeared before judges regularly, presented evidence, and argued their cases with confidence. Court documents across Europe prove that women were far from silent. They sued neighbors over stolen goods, challenged dishonest traders, and fought to keep their inheritance. The surprising part is how often they won. Even within a society that favored men, women learned how to navigate the system and come out ahead. Marriage did complicate things. Wives faced more restrictions, but many found creative ways to get around them. Some had their husbands formally grant them the right to manage business affairs alone. Others relied on local customs that allowed exceptions. And there is an entire level of female authority that rarely gets mentioned. Many medieval women were not defending themselves in court. They were the ones bringing charges. Widows who owned property frequently sued tenants for unpaid rent or damage to farmland. These were not timid housewives hiding behind men. They came prepared to argue and to win. Written contracts add another layer to the story. Women used their own seals, signed agreements, and arranged complex financial transactions that required legal follow-up when things went wrong. A baker's wife in 14th century London could sue a grain supplier with the same confidence as any man. It makes sense when you remember that survival often depended on strong business partnerships. But why did some women enjoy more legal freedom than others? Geography played a huge part in that. Women in German towns often had broader rights than those living in the French countryside. English common law looked nothing like the systems found in Italian city-states. Even within one kingdom, local customs could completely reverse expectations. Single women and widows usually held the strongest legal positions of all. Without husbands to legally represent them, they could act independently in many courts, almost the same way men did. Widows especially became forces of authority, managing estates, signing contracts, and resolving disputes with a confidence that would surprise anyone expecting them to be quiet and obedient. The most unexpected discovery is how effectively these women used written proof and formal legal methods that sound surprisingly modern. They kept records, gathered witnesses, and understood how to work through court procedures well enough to win property cases and financial disagreements. Their legal involvement went beyond personal issues too. Women who managed estates handled complaints from tenants, settled boundary conflicts, and enforced rental agreements as part of everyday administration. They were not just keeping households running. They were operating what looked very much like small governments, with all the power and responsibility that came with that. All this legal activity raises another question about what medieval women were doing outside the courtroom. Their involvement in marriage and personal choice is even more revealing. Marriage during the Middle Ages looked nothing like the love stories we imagine today. Forget romantic walks and poetic letters. Most marriages were arranged business arrangements. Families negotiated unions as though they were signing trade deals because, in many cases, that was exactly what they were doing. Parents matched children based on property, wealth, and social advancement. A blacksmith's daughter might marry a merchant's son to link their trades together. Noble families arranged unions that resembled political contracts more than love matches. Affection was not the goal, though it sometimes came later. Yet not all women were powerless in these decisions. Church law required both people to agree to a marriage. Social pressure was intense, but a woman could still refuse, and sometimes she did, particularly when faced with a cruel or unwanted suitor. In those cases, the church often defended her right to say no, at least in writing. Widows, again, stood in a unique position. Once their husbands died, they often gained control of wealth, property, and their personal choices. They could select a new husband or stay single. Many became active business owners, using remarriage as a way to expand their influence. Others decided to remain unmarried altogether, keeping their independence. The politics of remarriage added another layer to this power dynamic. A rich widow with property became a highly desirable prospect. Suitors lined up, but she controlled the outcome. She could choose a young partner, a wealthy one, or simply someone who would not interfere with her authority. Smart women often chose the latter option. Although the church preached strict morality, real life was far more complicated. Affairs happened. True divorce was nearly impossible, but annulments were possible for those who could afford them. Some couples lived apart for long periods, while others quietly ignored the formal restrictions. Marriage contracts themselves sometimes contained fascinating details. Women negotiated to keep certain lands or earnings separate from their husband's control. Some even included promises about fair treatment or living arrangements. These agreements were not about romance. They were survival strategies in a world that offered women few protections. Despite the practical nature of marriage, many partnerships functioned surprisingly well. When daily survival required cooperation, couples learned to rely on each other. Shared struggles and common goals often built respect and loyalty, even when love was not the foundation. Young women faced the greatest limitations, bound by family expectations and few options. But even they sometimes influenced outcomes through clever planning or delaying tactics. Individual circumstances shaped everything. A merchant's widow in London lived a completely different life from a peasant girl in rural France. Social rank, location, and family resources decided what choices were available. These same factors also influenced something else entirely: how medieval women expressed power and identity through clothing and public image. When people picture medieval women with authority, they often think of queens or legendary female warriors. But many of the most powerful women of the era wore veils instead of crowns. Abbesses, the heads of convents, controlled enormous wealth and influence. They were not silent figures tucked away in prayer. An abbess managed farmland, collected rents, oversaw workers, and directed the spiritual lives of both nuns and monks. The abbess of Fontevraud, for instance, ruled over men as well as women, a rare and remarkable situation. Imagine commanding male clergy in an age when most women could not even preach. It makes sense when you see how deeply religious institutions were tied to economics and politics. Then there were the noblewomen who turned diplomacy into an art form. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous women in medieval history, married 2 kings, outlived one, divorced the other, and continued to shape European politics for decades afterward. When her sons rose up against their father, guess who was quietly directing the rebellion? Eleanor was the mind behind it all, though she paid for her boldness with years in captivity. Even so, her influence stretched from the castles of England to the deserts of the Holy Land. But focusing only on famous names misses the bigger picture. Plenty of lesser-known noblewomen were making deals, arranging marriages that shifted entire kingdoms, and brokering peace agreements that stopped wars before they began. None of this was coincidence. It was calculated strategy disguised as domestic duty. Religious life offered another path for ambitious women, one that came with something revolutionary for the time: education. Convents became centers of learning where women read, wrote, managed finances, and studied everything from herbal medicine to theology. Hildegard of Bingen composed music, experimented with healing, and wrote letters to emperors, all while living under religious vows. What is truly remarkable is how soft influence worked in those centuries. A clever woman could whisper the right words over a meal and alter the outcome of a war. She could arrange a marriage that joined rival houses, ending years of bloodshed without a single sword being raised. Sometimes keeping peace required more brilliance than leading troops into battle. Even queens without formal power held real sway behind the scenes. They controlled who could approach the king, oversaw royal spending, and served as temporary rulers when their husbands left for crusades or died unexpectedly. Queen mothers were often the most formidable of all. They had already survived court intrigue once and were not about to let a young rival jeopardize their family's future. Religion added yet another layer of influence. In an age when divine authority carried enormous weight, the words of an abbess could echo far beyond her convent walls. People obeyed not because she charmed them, but because she was seen as a voice of divine wisdom. That gave women in religious positions a form of public authority that would have been impossible elsewhere. The most successful women of the Middle Ages understood a timeless truth: real power works best when it does not appear as power. They ruled through persuasion, partnership, and networks that spanned entire continents, proving that authority could exist in countless forms. Yet power was only one expression of who they were. The way medieval women dressed told another story entirely, one filled with creativity, pride, and identity. If you imagine your ancestors wearing dull brown rags, think again. Clothing in the Middle Ages was a visible symbol of wealth and class. Every outfit broadcasted its owner's social standing like a public announcement. A merchant's wife might wear a deep blue gown with silver clasps, while her maid dressed in plain, undyed linen. The contrast was deliberate and unmistakable. Colors carried enormous social meaning. Rich reds, royal purples, and vivid blues were costly because the dyes came from faraway lands. Wearing them was a clear declaration of status, a way of saying, "I can afford this." No one shouted those words, but their clothes did. That growing competition for fashion status made rulers uneasy. Across Europe, authorities began issuing sumptuary laws, strict dress codes meant to keep people in their social lanes. These laws covered everything from fabrics to sleeve length. Only nobles could wear fur trims or golden embroidery. Commoners faced stiff penalties for breaking the rules. But did anyone truly follow them? Hardly. Historical records show endless violations. People loved bending the rules. Women found clever ways to flaunt wealth while appearing to obey. Couldn't wear silk? They wore the finest wool in dazzling patterns instead. Banned from gold jewelry? They stacked up silver ornaments until they sparkled just as brightly. Fashion rebellion was alive and well. Beauty standards were another battlefield. Women plucked their hairlines to create the high forehead admired at the time. Pale skin symbolized privilege, proof you did not labor outdoors, so women used white powders, some containing toxic ingredients, to lighten their complexions. Many cosmetics were dangerous, but appearance often mattered more than safety. Jewelry had its own deeper purpose beyond adornment. Rings, brooches, and necklaces were portable assets. Wealth a woman could actually control. They could be sold, traded, or handed down. Smart women treated their jewelry collections like financial safety nets for uncertain times. Regional variations added even more flair. Italian women favored rich silks and fitted designs, while French fashion leaned toward flowing fabrics and elaborate veils. Trade brought new inspirations. Byzantine silks, Islamic patterns, and Flemish embroidery styles all left their mark on European wardrobes. Clothing trends spread quickly through merchants, pilgrims, and travelers long before social media ever existed. For the wealthy, clothing became a form of competition. The more intricate your outfit, the higher your status appeared. Towering headdresses, detailed stitching, and yards of trailing fabric served no practical purpose except to show that you did not need practicality. But even women of modest means found ways to express style. A well-tailored cloak, polished shoes, or an ornate belt buckle could make a simple outfit look dignified and proud. No matter their station, medieval women shared an understanding that still feels modern. Presentation mattered. Clothing was not only protection from the elements, but a language of self-expression, pride, and silent communication. Through every stitch, and every color choice. Women of the Middle Ages declared who they were and what they were worth in a world that often tried to define them otherwise.